All right, let's begin. The harbour at Ushuaia was buzzing with a strange electric energy the morning the southern sun eased away from the dock. It was January 4th, 1968, the height of the short southern summer, and those who lined the wooden pier could almost taste the salt and adventure in the air. This was no government-backed naval survey, no vast steel-strengthened icebreaker setting forth with the fanfare of flags and brass bands. The Southern Sun was a modest 34-meter steel-hulled motor yacht, privately refitted for oceanographic research and owned by a man who, in his words, preferred a horizon that left no land in sight. Her owner, Captain James Sinclair, was already something of a legend among sailors who haunted the southern tip of South America. Tall, wiry, and perpetually squinting against the sun or the spray, it was hard to tell which. He had made his fortune in shipping early in life and had spent the last decade seeking out waters where other men rarely sailed. The Weddell Sea had long been a ghostly name in his logbooks. Few ships dared its shifting flows, and fewer still returned with detailed charts. Sinclair was determined to change that. But Sinclair was not traveling alone, and this was no pleasure cruise. Aboard were 6 other souls: Dr. Margaret Lewis, a marine biologist from New Zealand; Raymond Ray Carter, an American oceanographer; 2 young Chilean deckhands, Luis and Matthias; Peter Worthing, a British engineer and mechanic; and Dr. Hamid Saleh, an Egyptian meteorologist who had spent his academic life studying polar weather from behind a desk but had never set foot in Antarctica. Their goal was deceptively simple: conduct the first independent oceanographic survey of the southern Weddell Sea, a notoriously ice-clogged stretch that even national Antarctic programs rarely penetrated without the might of an icebreaker. They would gather samples of seawater, document ice movement, and record deep-sea acoustic readings. Their data potentially priceless for understanding marine ecosystems in one of the planet's least-known regions. In theory, they would skirt the worst of the pack ice during the height of summer, complete their work within 3 months, and return before the first autumn freeze. Think of the ambition, friends. No satellite ice forecasts to guide them, no GPS, only charts based on decades-old whaling records, sextant readings, and the raw instinct of a captain who trusted his eyes and the angle of the wind more than any printed map. The science community in South America whispered that Sinclair was a madman, that no private vessel of his size could operate in those waters safely. But the crew believed. They had to believe. The Southern Sun cut through the Beagle Channel under a brisk wind, her twin Perkins diesel engines humming confidently. Behind them, the jagged Andes faded into haze. Ahead lay open ocean, the Drake Passage, those haunted, myth-born waters where 40-foot swells roared without mercy, and beyond that, the unmarked mysteries of the ice. Below deck, the scientists secured delicate instruments against the coming shake of the passage. On deck, Luis and Matthias checked lashings for the lifeboats and reinforced the cables securing the deck crates of fuel drums and tinned stores. By the 3rd day at sea, they encountered the first ice, lonely white flows swirling in cobalt water like fragments of a shattered temple. Seabirds wheeled overhead, the winds now biting cold. Dr. Lewis took the first water temperature readings, her voice crisp as she called the numbers to Carter at the logbook. 1.4 degrees Celsius at surface. Sinclair noted the early arrival of drift ice but kept his course steady, saying only, "Plenty of sea room ahead." But the Weddell had its own designs. Within a week of crossing the Antarctic Circle, scattered flows thickened into a maze. Where the notebook sketches from prior expeditions showed open channels, they found walls of ice, grinding slowly under a pale sun. Worthing, the engineer, could hear it through the hull at night, a deep, ceaseless groan and crack like something alive. One evening, as the pale light stretched close to midnight, Dr. Saleh presented his latest barometer readings to Sinclair. The numbers hinted at a coming pressure drop. "A low," Saleh warned, "fast-moving and likely from the southeast. If it coincides with wind-driven ice..." His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Sinclair frowned, tracing his finger along the chart. We'll edge east while we can, he decided. No sense letting the pack close her jaws just yet. Those first days were still filled with optimism. Even as fingers numbed during deck work and thin films of ice began appearing on the railings, the crew kept spirits high. Doctor. Lewis got her first plankton samples. Carter tested a new sonar rig that purred like a cat against the inky water. And Matthias kept everyone laughing with pantomimes of imaginary penguin parades. Yet under that laughter lay a tension, an unspoken awareness that the ice was materializing far quicker than anyone had expected. On January 28th, 3 weeks into the voyage, Sinclair climbed to the crosstrees with binoculars. To the north, open water gleamed. To the south, where their course pointed, a pale ridge of unbroken flow stretched to the horizon. The Weddell Sea watched them with a still, frozen patience. Sinclair climbed down, his jaw tight. They pressed on, but the first hints of trouble had taken root. The sky was shifting, the ice was changing, and the clock of the Antarctic summer was ticking in a language they were only beginning to understand. And soon, the warnings nature offered in whispers would turn into roars. Shall I write the next chapter? The memory of that pale ridge of ice was still fresh in their minds when the first real blow fell. It began quietly, too quietly for such a vast sheet of wind and weather. The evening was calm, the water dark and glassy, when Dr. Saleh's barometer needle dipped so sharply that he tapped the face twice to make sure it wasn't stuck. By dawn, the wind had shifted from a gentle northwesterly to an ice-laced blast from the southeast, exactly as he had predicted. And with the wind came movement. Ominous, unstoppable movement. The floes that had been scattered the previous day began to knit together. They collided with deep, rumbling thuds against the Southern Sun's hull, sending tremors down into the steel bones of the ship. Sinclair ordered the engines to half, then 3/4, pushing the bow into the narrow lanes still snaking between slabs of ice, hoping to keep ahead of the closing jaws. Luis and Matthias used steel poles to shove at smaller floes, but the ocean was rearranging itself faster than any human effort could counter. By mid-afternoon, visibility fell as snow arrived, driven in horizontal sheets. The sky became a seamless blur of grey. The horizon dissolved in brightness. It was now impossible to tell where sea ended and ice began without the dull smacking of floes against the ship. Any open channels were masked with a veneer of fresh snow. "White out," Carter muttered, pulling his scarf higher across his face. Every instinct in the captain's battered frame told him this was no fleeting squall, but the opening act of something larger. That night, they hove to, drifting under minimal power to avoid smashing into ice in the dark hours. Not that darkness was the deep night of home. The sun merely sagged low, but never vanished. Every few minutes came the dull crunch of the hull meeting drifting ice, followed by the cold echo through the deck plates. Lewis lay awake in her cabin, staring at the ceiling, counting each impact, willing herself not to imagine the rivets pulling loose. When morning brought them a break in the snow, the view was worse than Sinclair feared. They were no longer weaving through scattered ice. Instead, the southern sun floated inside a vast, slowly shifting field. A mosaic of floes jammed so tightly together that each swell passed beneath them as though under one continent of ice. Sinclair climbed to the wheelhouse roof and scanned in every direction. Nothing but endless white, fractured with seams where the floes strained and buckled. A meeting was called in the cramped mess. Saleh explained that early-season pack completely enclosing a vessel was rare but not unheard of. However, once locked in, a ship could drift for weeks before a wind change freed her. "It is best we conserve fuel now," he advised. "We cannot fight what is larger than the horizon." Conserve fuel. It sounded reasonable in theory, but it meant giving up control, allowing themselves to drift wherever the current and wind dictated. Sinclair tapped the table with one hand. "We track our drift, we keep our bearings, and when the first lead opens wide enough, we move." Everyone nodded, but in their eyes he could see the same thought. This was not part of the plan. Days stretched into a week. The ship creaked constantly as the ice pressed and eased, like the breathing of some enormous beast. Carter's sonar could still ping through the water below, and the scientists continued what measurements they could. But every step outside required care. One slip on the frost-glazed deck and the water's edge was closer than it looked. Temperatures dropped, and the diesel heaters ran longer each night. Then, on February 15th, they had their first true scare. At 3 a.m., a cracking noise unlike any before jolted everyone awake. The portside ice had shifted suddenly, slamming a floe the size of a house against the midship. The steel moaned. Worthing was already up, wrench in hand, racing to check for leaks. There were none, but in the engine room he found signs of strain on the propeller shaft system, where pressure had jarred the alignment. The news hit Sinclair like a blow. The engines were their lifeline. Any damage there meant the mercy of the ice entirely. He ordered Worthing to keep them running only during maneuvers and to begin extracting extra precautions. Heavier greasing, more frequent checks, a watch never left empty. All the while, the weather toyed with them. Brief calms where the sun glinted off crystal ridges, followed by sudden squalls that drove more ice in from the east. Their planned survey routes lay forgotten under miles of unbroken pack. The scientific ambitions that had burned so bright in December were dimming under the grind of survival calculations. How much diesel they could burn daily, how to stretch food stores without losing strength in the cold, how to keep morale from plunging into despair's deep well. One afternoon, Dr. Lewis caught Sinclair alone on deck. "Captain," she said quietly, "at this rate, will we make it out before the winter freeze?" Sinclair watched the slow roll of pressure ridges in the distance before answering. "If the pack loosens in the next fortnight, yes. If not." He didn't finish, but they both understood. In the Antarctic, a fortnight could be the difference between liberation and entombment for a year. The southern sun kept its lonely vigil, the ice now their fortress and their prison. And just when it seemed they might wait this out, a single moment of misfortune would tear away even the illusion of control. Because one cold March morning, under a pale, pitiless sun, they would try to force the ship toward a narrow lead of water, and that choice would change the expedition forever. Shall I write the next chapter? The morning of March 3rd began with what felt almost like hope. After more than 15 days of seeing nothing but a locked sheet of white, a dark ribbon appeared on the southern horizon. A lead, narrow but shimmering with open water. It might have been no more than a quarter-mile wide, but to Sinclair's eyes it glittered like a salvation road. In the wheelhouse, he studied it through binoculars. The ice around them had shifted in the night, creaking like tired timber and yawning open in that inviting line. "If we don't move now," he told Worthing and Carter, "it'll close as quickly as it came. We go easy, gentle on the shaft, and get her clear." His voice was firm, but the air between them was electric with urgency. Worthing hesitated. "Captain, we've kept power low for a reason. That alignment's delicate. If the flows shift while we're midway—" Sinclair cut him short. "We're not wintering here, Peter. Not in this coffin." Everyone was called to stations. Luis and Matthias manned ice poles at the bow to probe the thickness of the floes ahead, nudging smaller slabs aside. Dr. Saleh came topside to monitor wind. Lewis and Carter secured all loose gear below. The hum of the twin diesels swelled from the engine room. Slowly, cautiously, the southern sun nosed forward, the bow slipping into the narrow lead. The smell of open water, faint but undeniable, reached them. For 20 minutes, they made deliberate progress, pushing through small rubble ice, Sinclair coaxing the wheel like a man guiding a horse through mud. The sound was hypnotic. The hiss of slush against the hull, the occasional crunch of ice giving way. It felt, for these brief minutes, as though perhaps luck had finally returned to their side. Then came the grinding shock. It started with a judder beneath their feet, subtle enough that Sinclair at first thought they'd hit a submerged piece of brash ice. But the vibration deepened into a shuddering roar from the stern. Worthing's voice bellowed from below. Kill the starboard! Kill it now! Sinclair yanked the throttle down, then the port as well. Silence, save for the groan of metal cooling. Worthing stormed up from the engine room, his face the color of chalk. She's done. Propeller shafts cracked. Maybe at the coupling, maybe worse. We can't run her without tearing it clean out. The words sank into the crew like lead into water. The lead of open water still lay ahead, tantalizing, but the southern sun might as well have been embedded in concrete. They drifted, powerless, as the current began to carry them again into thicker ice. By mid-afternoon, the channel had narrowed behind glassy ridges, then closed entirely. The opportunity was gone. Now they were truly trapped, not just by the ice, but by their own broken machinery. That evening, Sinclair gathered them in the mess. The small room felt smaller still, shoulders pressed together, eyes fixed on the table. "We have no means to push free," he said flatly. "We'll drift with the pack until conditions change." He glanced at the charts, though the gesture was mostly for himself. The Weddell's currents are unpredictable. We might be carried north toward the open sea in weeks, or south, deeper into the ice. Lewis immediately asked the question on everyone's mind. "And supplies?" "We ration starting tomorrow," Sinclair replied. "Food, diesel, everything. Drill the water ice from flows to conserve tanks. That's how we'll get through." The word "get through" seemed too thin for the weight of what they faced. In that moment, each person in that cabin understood the science mission was over. What lay ahead was something else entirely: the long, cold mathematics of survival in one of the most uninhabitable places on Earth. The first night, without the comfort of potential escape, was the hardest. The ship moaned under pressure. Carter lay in his bunk, staring at the faint frost forming on the ceiling above him despite their constant heating. Somewhere above, he could hear Luis and Matias murmuring in Spanish. Their words too low to catch, but their tone carrying the same uneasy edge that rattled in his own chest. Days blurred into one another. The absence of tasks beyond maintenance made time slippery. Night and day were scarcely different in the dim southern light. Shadows of ice ridges drifted across the portholes. Sometimes the flows opened briefly, revealing black water dotted with bergy bits, only to close again like scars knitting shut. They had no control over where they went, cradled and squeezed by forces too vast for human argument. They still took measurements when conditions permitted, Saleh charting every barometric change, Carter taking salinity samples from drilled ice holes. But now their record-keeping took on a new edge. It was the log of survivors marking time, not explorers marking progress. And then came the first sign of trouble among them. On March 19th, Matias awoke fevered, his cheeks flushing even in the cold. Dr. Lewis examined him, suspecting a lung infection brought on by wet clothes and prolonged exposure on deck. The small medical kit aboard offered antibiotics, but the incident drove home a brutal reality. In this frozen expanse, even a cough could be a death sentence. They tended to Matias in the galley, the warmest space they had, while Sinclair leaned over the chart table for hours at a time, tracing currents that might, just might, push them toward salvation once the grip of winter loosened. No one spoke aloud of how far off August or September felt. The horizon had changed in their minds. It was no longer the distant edge of their voyage, but the thin boundary between endurance and collapse. And within days, the long drifting ordeal would begin to strip away not just their stores, but parts of themselves they hadn't expected to lose. Shall I write the next chapter? The days after Matias fell ill marked the beginning of what the crew would later call the long wait. The Weddell Sea was no longer just a frozen desert around them. It was an enormous, patient predator, moving them where it pleased and challenging their will to endure without ever striking a single visible blow. Life settled into a strange rhythm. Morning began with the creaking chorus of the hull under pressure. Anyone sleeping lightly could feel a faint vibration when massive flows pressed from different angles. Sinclair insisted on daily rounds. checking for leaks or ruptured seams, inspecting diesel fuel reserves, examining the state of the heaters. Fuel was the most tightly guarded resource now. Without it for warmth, they would not survive winter's approach. The mess became their gathering point, a cramped refuge where the smell of paraffin heaters mingled with tinned stew or thin porridge. Conversation early on stayed polite. Weather, science, stray memories of home. But weeks of confinement have a way of stripping away the social varnish. By April, tempers began to fray in small, quiet ways. Ray Carter snapping at Dr. Lewis over the misplaced lid of a sample jar. Matthias growing cold and withdrawn when Luis accused him of shirking chores. Sinclair pacing the narrow deck at night as though stalking invisible prey. Beyond the human frictions came the creeping psychological effect of endless white. The horizon gave no landmark, the sky and ice often blending into one another so completely that even Sinclair, a man who could read waves like printed words, admitted it was hard to tell direction without a compass. Every day looked like the one before, the same soft howl of wind, the same faint, sharp scent of frozen salt. On clear days, they could see pressure ridges in the distance, jagged as broken teeth. Sometimes they heard the snaps and low booms of ice shifting miles away, vibrations traveling through the pack and into their souls. That sound carried a reminder. At any moment, a pressure surge could crush the southern sun if caught in the wrong position. The steel hull gave a layer of confidence. But even steel had its limits under thousands of tons of moving ice. To fill the time and keep minds sharp, Sinclair instituted maintenance drills and basic chores that rotated daily. Carter ran sonar sweeps when leads opened. Dr. Lewis catalogued and labeled what specimens they had gathered before entrapment. Saleh taught the two Chileans how to read sextants and winds, framing it as preparing for the journey we'll one day make to rescue ourselves. It brought a nervous laugh at first, until everyone understood he meant it literally. By late April, Matthias began recovering, but the cost was visible. He had lost weight, his hollow eyes betraying exhaustion. The reality hung in the air. One bout of severe illness had nearly claimed him, and winter had not yet truly arrived. As temperatures dropped further, condensation in the cabins froze overnight. They lined bunks with extra clothing and gear to keep from losing body heat through the steel. Fuel rationing became severe. Heaters ran only at designated times. Morning warm-up, evening meal. The rest of the day, they wore layers upon layers, breath forming constant ghosts before their faces. It was during one of these cold stretches that Dr. Lewis began keeping a separate journal, not of specimens or science, but of each person's mood and state. "The crew is weathering," she wrote. "Not like wood to be seasoned, but like rope left out in salt wind. Some strands fray faster than others." By the end of May, the light itself began to fade. Twilight stretched long, the sun brushing the horizon for only a few hours at a time. Isolation deepened into something heavier. Days without radio contact slipped by, either from interference or from ice shielding the antenna. The scientists spoke less of analyses and more about favorite meals from home, or the warmth of sunlight on summer skin, things they hadn't felt in what now seemed a lifetime. The breaking point came one evening when a storm swept across the pack. Pressure built in sharp bursts. The hull groaned under a fresh assault. They braced themselves in the mess, lantern light shivering against the walls. A particularly violent shove of ice made the entire vessel lurch. Loose mugs crashed to the floor. That night, Sinclair remained at the wheel, not to steer but to see and hear for himself if anything changed out there in the chaos. When morning came, everyone's eyes were ringed with fatigue. The next week, their fortunes took another turn. The first barrels of diesel began freezing sludgy at the base. Worthing rigged an improvised heating system to keep the remaining supply usable, but it was an unmistakable signal from the environment. Every day would now test them harder. It was then, in the constant grind of survival, that Sinclair began quietly working over an idea. He'd made no official announcement. but his occasional questions to Saleh about distances to the South Orkney Islands, his observations of the ice's drift direction, and his quiet conversations with Worthing about modifying the ship's lifeboats all hinted at a thought both terrifying and seductive. They were trapped in the Weddell's grip, yes, but perhaps their salvation didn't lie in waiting for release. Perhaps it lay in leaving the southern sun behind entirely. Once he voiced it aloud, there would be no going back. And that decision, friends, would set them on a path as dangerous as the icebound drift itself. Shall I write the next chapter? It was the first week of June when Sinclair finally spoke the idea out loud. The wind had been cutting from the south for 2 straight days, a steady, merciless stream that kept the deck glazed with new frost and carried fine snow into every crack of the southern sun. Most of the crew huddled in the mess that evening. Outside, the ever-present groan of shifting ice filled the air, low and restless. Inside, Sinclair sat at the head of the narrow table, a steaming mug between his palms. His eyes focused not on any of them, but on the middle distance, somewhere far beyond the mess, beyond the ice itself. "I think we have a choice to make," he began, his voice carrying just enough authority to still the side conversations. "We keep waiting here for the ice to break. Maybe in August, maybe September. Or—" He hesitated just long enough for tension to creep in, then leaned forward. "We take one of the lifeboats, strip it down, reinforce it, and make a run for the South Orkneys." For a moment, no one replied. The lifeboats were heavy, open-decked, designed for survival after abandonment, not for a voyage of hundreds of miles across one of the roughest stretches of ocean on Earth in the dead of the austral winter. The South Orkneys were at least 500 miles away, possibly more depending on how the drift had carried them. And between here and there were gales, freezing spray that could ice a vessel solid, and fields of drifting bergs large enough to punch a hole through any unarmored hull. Worthing spoke first. "You'd have us cross that distance in an open boat, Captain. Those waters in June, it's not suicide, but it's damned close. Closer than sitting here while the ice carries us south," Sinclair countered, his voice low and even. "I've been watching the drift, Saleh's currents, my charts. They point northward for the first time in weeks. That lead may not open for the southern sun, but we might work a smaller craft through." Luis looked up sharply. "And the rest of us? You leave us here?" "I'd take a small crew, 4, maybe 5 at most. The strongest rowers and hands we have. Enough to make speed and still man watches. We'd carry sails, oars, the radio if we can rig an antenna. We get to the Orkneys, find a whaler's station, or signal a passing ship. Bring them back for you." Dr. Lewis furrowed her brow. "What happens here if the worst happens to you?" Sinclair met her gaze. "Then you keep doing what we've been doing, stretching supplies, surviving until the ice sees fit to spit you out. But at least someone will have tried." The room fell into uneasy silence, broken only by the kettle hissing on the stove. It was Saleh who finally tipped the balance. "I believe the drift has shifted," he said slowly. "We are nearer to the Orkneys now than we will be by spring. If we attempt it, this is the narrowest window we will have." Over the next 3 days, talk of the lifeboat plan dominated every gathering. Worthing inspected the sturdiest of the ship's boats, a 21-foot clinker-built craft, and declared it serviceable if reinforced with additional planks and fitted with canvas decking to keep out spray. They stripped unnecessary weight, added lashings for provisions, and scavenged a small mast and sail from spare spars and rigging. The boat had no shelter besides the decking and canvas, no room to spare for the comfort of its crew. They planned for 4 men, Sinclair, Worthing, Luis, and Carter, chosen for their seamanship, strength, and ability to navigate in harsh conditions. Saleh would guide them using a sextant and compass before they departed and provide weather predictions as best he could without full instruments. Their ration load would be tight, only enough food for 3 weeks, with the hope that the voyage would take less than half that if conditions favored them. On June 14th, the boat was lowered into a narrow lead alongside the southern sun. The wind carried a biting sting that froze bare skin in minutes, but the lead extended far enough northward to hold the promise of progress. The rest of the crew gathered to see them off, their silence heavy with the knowledge of the stakes. Sinclair stood for a moment in the lifeboat, looking back at the ship that had carried them this far. "Hold on," he told Dr. Lewis and Saleh. "Keep her safe. If luck's with us, you'll see a rescue on this horizon before the next moon cycle." The oars bit into the black, icy water. Slowly, the southern sun shrank to a silhouette against the endless field of ice, her deck a small blot of human warmth in a world of cold. Ahead, the lifeboat crew faced a journey that would test every survival skill they possessed. The first night, the wind shifted west, bringing with it rolling swells that slapped the hull with freezing spray. The canvas decking crackled with ice by dawn. They were only a day out when a dense fog settled over the sea, erasing the horizon. Worthing steered by compass while Sinclair kept watch for the looming shapes of icebergs materializing from the blankness. Luis bailed constantly, fighting to keep water from pooling in the bilge, while Carter kept the sail trimmed to squeeze out every bit of northward speed. With each pull of the oars, each hour of the frigid watch, they were gambling their lives against the promise that someone, somewhere, would see them, and then find their way back to the drifting southern sun. The enormity of that gamble grew heavier with each mile, each blast of polar wind. And soon, the Southern Ocean would show them exactly what it thought of men who dared its winter waters. Shall I write the next chapter? The Southern Ocean's answer came on their fourth day at sea. It began with a fine mist forming low on the horizon to the northwest, a thin veil that congealed into a wall of grey by afternoon. The breeze stiffened, snapping at the edges of the makeshift sail, and the water turned from iron blue to a flat, ugly leaden hue. Sinclair, seated aft with the tiller, kept glancing at the clouds stacking low and heavy, their undersides the colour of bruises. "She's coming," he muttered to Worthing, who was tightening the canvas decking to keep spray from flooding them. By dusk, the first hard swell lifted their little boat, dropping it into a hollow where the wind tore at them with sudden force. The temperature fell sharply. The next wave of spray froze instantly where it struck, turning the oar handles slick and numbing their fingers. Luis tried to sing half-heartedly to keep his spirits up, but even his usual energy was muted by the bite in the air and the growing dark. The storm hit in earnest after nightfall. It was no polite warning gust, but a full polar blow, 40 knots or more, backed by long, heavy waves that should have belonged to bigger latitudes. The boat rolled and pitched violently, each crest threatening to throw them sideways into the trough. They shipped water twice in the first hour. On the third near capsize, Sinclair ordered them to reduce sail completely and ride under bare poles, trusting their weight and steering to keep the bow into the waves. Hours blurred into a cold, wet purgatory. Hands burned from clinging to wet lines and frozen wood. Worthing's beard was a mask of ice. Carter's lips split and bled in the bitter air. Luis kept up the bailing, his movements slowing each time until Sinclair would shout his name, jarring him back from the half-conscious drift that signaled the onset of hypothermia. At one point, Carter spotted a darker shadow looming in the spray's chaos. A berg taller than a 10-story building gliding silently to leeward. It passed a dozen boat lengths away, indifferent to the fragile human life, shuddering past it. Every man stared at it, each privately aware that one wrong drift of the bow could end them in a minute. The gale's second day was worse. Every surface was glazed. When the thin winter sunlight broke through ragged clouds, it lit their boat like a frozen sculpture. The weight of accumulating ice began to sap what little stability they had. Worthing crawled along the deck with a small hammer, chipping at the worst of the ice on the gunwale, while Luis and Carter alternated on the pump and oars just to keep bow control against the sea. Their food remained untouched. The cold had closed every stomach to hunger. It was on the storm's third and final night that their luck wavered dangerously. A following sea caught them partially broadside, heaving them onto a wave that shoved the port quarter down far enough to scoop water over the deck. The sudden slam of cold nearly froze Carter's arms as he bailed. Sinclair hauled them back into the wave's face with a heave of the tiller that seemed more instinct than conscious thought. The boat responded, sluggish but obedient, and they staggered through the rest of the night without further disaster. When morning came at last, the wind had eased to a tense, restless swell. The sea was littered with brash ice and growlers, forcing them to steer constantly to avoid collision. Each man looked 20 years older. Faces were drawn, skin pale where it showed through windburn, eyes red and narrowed against the glare. The canvas decking was ragged from chafing lines. The little mast lashed low and useless for the moment. They were alive, but the storm had shoved them farther west than they had planned, cutting away precious miles from their target. The sextant reading Carter took at noon confirmed it. They had lost nearly 2 days' progress, and their remaining provisions had already dropped to less than 2 weeks' worth. Sinclair didn't voice the numbers, but they were in every furrow on his forehead. 2 more days passed in an exhausted rhythm of trimming sail in light winds, bailing meltwater, and coaxing the boat around endless fields of drifting ice. On the 8th morning, they caught the first hint of smell on the wind. Not the clean nothing of ice, but a faint, damp scent of kelp and guano. Sinclair looked north with a tight smile. "Landbirds soon," he said. Sure enough, by evening, a pair of dark shapes wheeled high overhead, too distant to name, but certain proof that land was not unimaginable miles away. But the Southern Ocean would not let them glide to shore so easily. In the small hours, another squall line appeared from the southeast, this one less ferocious, but colder still. The wind bit through their layers and turned every exposed patch of skin into raw agony. Progress slowed again as they hove to for hours, drifting in the company of icebergs like ghostly towers. At last, on the 12th morning, there it was, a jagged grey smudge low on the horizon, trembling in the haze. The South Orkneys. None of them cheered. They were far too spent. The battle wasn't over. The islands were ringed with reefs, shoals, and upright cliffs where waves smashed themselves into white chaos. Between exhaustion, cold, and navigational hazards, they faced one final trial before salvation. And in that final approach lay the thinnest of margins, between rescue and vanishing into the iron embrace of the Southern Ocean forever. Shall I write the next chapter? They saw the islands in the pale morning light, but reaching them would take everything they had left. The South Orkneys rose from the sea like black, glistening teeth, their slopes streaked with snow and shadows from overhanging cliffs. Sinclair kept the bow aimed at the largest of the group, Coronation Island, scanning for any break in the sheer walls or some hint of a landing site. Waves burst white against the rocks, sending plumes of spray that shone briefly in the thin sunlight before the wind tore them apart. Worthing glanced up from his crouch at the oars, his voice hoarse from days of cold air. "If there's a beach here, it's hiding well." Sinclair nodded grimly. "There's an old whaling station on Signey Island, about 15 miles east. If there's anywhere still standing with shelter, it'll be there. We aim for that." The 12 days at sea had taken their toll. Hands red and split from salt and ice, lips blistered, eyes bleary and sharp all at once. More than once they'd snapped at each other out of exhaustion, but now the silence between them was purposeful. Every movement focused on making good each precious mile before the weather turned again. The closer they came, the more savage the coastline looked. It was ringed with brash ice, driven against the rocks, the swell booming constantly like distant artillery. A mistake here, one missed current, one wave breaking over the stern, and the lifeboat would be dashed to splinters in moments. Sinclair decided to take the long way around the western side, using his knowledge of the currents from earlier voyages in these latitudes. It would cost them hours they could barely afford, but the lee might give them a fighting chance to land. By mid-afternoon, the wind freshened, carrying the unmistakable cries of seabirds. Dark petrels wheeled only yards from the mast, their eyes bright and alien in the dim light. Then came the smell, rich, rank guano, so dense it caught in the throat, proof of rookeries hidden along the cliffs. To Sinclair, it smelled like landfall. They rounded a point where the cliffs sank to low headlands of rock and scree. There, in the curve of the shore, lay what they had been searching for. The skeletal remains of old whaling buildings, their roofs half gone, but enough standing to promise walls against the wind. It was Signy's long-abandoned station, but the sea was still between them and survival. An outer line of reefs guarded the inlet, some visible as jagged shadows beneath the water, others only revealed when a wave broke white over their peaks. The channel in was narrow, 20 yards wide at most, with the swell wrapping in from either side. Sinclair checked each man's position, then gave the order. Worthing and Luis bent to the oars while Carter kept the sails slanted to squeeze every inch of speed from the patchy breeze. Sinclair steered them straight for the gap, timing the approach between the sets. A wall of green water lifted behind them. Luis stole a glance over his shoulder and shouted, but Sinclair was already hauling on the tiller, angling down the waves back. They shot into the channel like an arrow between jaws that snapped shut a heartbeat later. The swell carried them forward into suddenly calmer water, the cliffs breaking the worst of the wind. They were inside. It was still a hard row up to the kelp-thick shore, and dragging the boat above the tide line took what little strength they had left. When at last they collapsed on the stony beach, the relief was so deep it was almost painful, leaving them trembling and near silent. Above them, the weathered shapes of the whaling station beckoned like the ruins of a long-lost civilization. They found one building with 3 standing walls and a collapsed roof. It was enough. They hauled their supplies inside, rigged the canvas sail across the open side to block the wind, and lit the small stove they had carried in hopes of exactly this kind of landfall. The heat was thin, but it thawed their hands and faces, and for the first time since leaving the southern sun, they were not surrounded by heaving water. That night, as the wind howled beyond their shelter, Sinclair set off the emergency flares they'd been saving, bright red blossoms in the cold, clear dark. Signals sent into emptiness in the hope someone would be watching. They had no radio power left. It was the oldest kind of hope, fire and light on the horizon. 2 days later, they spotted a faint mast line on the edge of the sea and piled out onto the beach to light the last of their signal flares. The vessel drew closer, Chilean Navy markings painted sharp and clean against the hull. They waded knee-deep into the surf when the landing boat came, voices hoarse with exhaustion but jubilant all the same. They had been seen. They had lived. The first words Sinclair managed, after explaining their situation and the crew still trapped aboard the Southern Sun, were simple. We go back for them now. And back into the treacherous waters they would go, because half of them were still out there, locked in the Weddell Sea's grip. Shall I write the next chapter? The Chilean Navy corvette. Piloto Pardo lay in Signy Island's small bay for less than 12 hours before setting course back toward the edge of the pack ice. Her captain, Commander Esteban Valdez, understood the urgency. 5 men were still alive out there somewhere on the drifting southern sun, and the austral winter tightened its grip with every passing day. Sinclair, though gaunt and hollow-eyed after nearly 2 weeks in an open boat, refused to rest. He knew the ice could shift without warning, obliterating open leads in hours. On the bridge, he traced the drift patterns from his memory and Saleh's earlier logs, cross-checking them with the Chileans' sparse but valuable ice reports. Each hour's steam toward the south was an hour in the balance between rescue and too late. The first sight of the ice edge came at dawn on the 3rd day out. It stretched to the east and west endlessly, irregular and brilliant in the low sun. Beyond it lay the white desert that had claimed the southern sun. The Piloto Pardo slowed as her ice-hardened bow began nudging through the outer brash, her engines throbbing with a deep vibration. The lookout scanned constantly for heavier flows that could cripple even a naval vessel if struck too hard. By mid-morning, the radio crackled, static, then a burst of unmistakable human voice. It was Saleh. The words were faint, broken with interference, but they were enough to make every head on the bridge turn. He was alive. The southern sun was still intact. Her position matched Sinclair's calculation almost exactly, though she was pressed into heavier ice than he'd feared. Breaking through took all that day and the next. The corvette would surge forward, ramming a lead, then reverse and try again, churning the water white against the ice's unyielding mass. Sinclair stood at the bow each time, eyes locked ahead, as though sheer will could open the floes wider. When at last the southern sun came into view, the sight struck them silent. She was pinched between two enormous slabs, her deck rimed with frost, smoke from the galley chimney rising like a fragile thread into the grey sky. Figures appeared on deck, waving. Even through binoculars, their movements seemed slow, deliberate, the pace of men who had measured every action against a ledger of calories and energy for months. The Piloto Pardo edged alongside as far as the ice allowed. The final approach had to be made by the corvette's smaller motor launch, weaving through narrow gaps and shouldering aside floating chunks. Sinclair insisted on going in that launch, his hands gripping the gunnels as they drew up under the southern sun's rail. Dr. Lewis was the first to greet him, her face thinner but her eyes brighter than he'd feared. Saleh and Luis followed, helping Matthias, now recovered enough to stand but still fragile, over the rail. There were no long speeches, no grand outbursts. Just the raw relief of warmth waiting, of food close at hand, of an ordeal ending. Transferring the 5 survivors to the corvette took hours, each man bundled immediately into blankets and pressed hot mugs into his hands. Only when they were all aboard did Commander Valdez turn the Piloto Pardo north for the ice edge, throttles open, the ship working hard to leave the frozen labyrinth behind. It took another day to clear the southern limit of the pack. When the open sea rolled under their hull again, the difference in motion brought smiles of disbelief to faces that had almost forgotten the feel of unobstructed water. Over mugs of thick navy coffee in the wardroom, Sinclair listened as Lewis described the past weeks aboard the trapped vessel. The dwindling fuel rationing, the frozen condensation in bunks, the psychological strain when the ice pressure would groan and snap at night with no way to know if the hull was moments from giving way. By the time they reached the naval station at King George Island, word of the rescue had already flashed through South America's coastal ports and into the Antarctic research community. The southern sun was lost to the ice. She would drift, scrape, and eventually sink in some unmarked place. But all 11 souls from her manifest were alive to tell the tale. They stepped ashore together, thinner, older, but bound by something few humans would ever understand. The shared memory of months in the world's most relentless prison, and the desperate gamble that had snatched them back from its grip. The Navy men who had brought them home shook their hands as equals with the respect sailors reserve for those who have survived the things they themselves fear. In the quiet that followed, as the group settled into the warmth of barracks and the unfamiliar comfort of real beds, Sinclair found himself thinking not of the cold, or the hunger, or the storms, but of the way the ice had closed in that first time, white and silent, as if it had been waiting for them all along. The world would move on quickly, he knew. But there, at the edge of the inhabited world, they had carved out their own epilogue. And in years to come, small pieces of the southern sun's story would drift back into the world. Through charts improved by Saleh's drift records, through scientific notes from Carter and Lewis on ice algae and pack density, through the way their ordeal would become one more quiet legend, stitched into the vast, cold fabric of Antarctic history. And somewhere deep in the Weddell Sea, the ice still shifted, remade, and drifted, caring nothing for the men it had spared.